First of all, welcome to Mirna. Thank you so much for doing this presentation for us, and also to introduce Martine Colombienne from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and also from Strive, a researcher with Strive, who will be hosting the Learning Lab today. If you don't already know about Strive, we're a research consortium led from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, but with partners in India, Tanzania, South Africa, and Uganda, as well as UNDP. We're funded by DFID. We've been going for several years, and we have an extremely rich website full of resources, including all the previous 40-something learning labs. So please do make use of our resources. And now I'm going to hand over to Martine Colombienne to introduce Mirna.
Well, welcome everyone, and welcome Mirna Guha, who is working towards the end of her PhD. So the work she's going to present is basically her PhD research. I think she plans to finish the end of this year. And Mirna has done a degree in an MA in Gender and International Development at the University of Warwick, and now her PhD is at the University of East Anglia at the School of Development, and she will say a little bit more of who her supervisors are. And I just want to say that she has quite some experience in working first in a group, more sort of anti-trafficking or a group of working NGOs with sex workers in West Bengal, and now has, through her research, has sort of learned quite a lot about the reality of sex work, and that's what she wants to present and is very, very excited about. So I'm going to give the word now to Mirna.
Thank you, Martine, for the introduction, and thank you, Annie, as well. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Before I begin, I would like to thank Strive for giving me this opportunity to share my research on this incredible platform. The title for today's webinar is, open quote, "I might do sex work, but I'm also a mother, daughter, and a lover. A study of sex work, social relations, and violence in the lives of female sex workers in Eastern India." On this slide, you can see a roadmap for today's webinar. So I've roughly divided the session into two parts. In the first part, I will give you an overview of the research, moving on to its need, methodology, location, and sample. In the second part, I shall share my areas of analysis and very briefly some of my key findings and analysis regarding pathways into sex work and social relations within red light areas, ending with some concluding thoughts from my research. To be honest, it's been a bit of a struggle trying to compress a PhD research into a 25-minute webinar, but I've tried to pack as much information and analysis into the content as possible, and I'm very happy to discuss things in more details during the Q&A part of the session. So let's get started. Let me begin by giving you an overview of the research that is at the heart of today's webinar. It's an ongoing PhD research. It's situated within the School of International Development at the University of East Anglia. It is funded by the Postgraduate Internationalization Studentship provided by the Social Sciences faculty at the university. It was started in October 2013, and it's supervised by Professor Nitya Rao and Professor Cecile Jackson. It is a qualitative research on the lives of women in sex work, former and current, in Eastern India. So the essence of my research is an exploration of the social worlds inhabited by women who are either currently engaged in or were engaged in sex work in Eastern India. I'm interested in understanding women within my study not only as sex workers, but as social entities, performing social responsibilities, taking on social roles, and forming social bonds within the working and non-working aspects of their lives. I want to understand how social relations drive entry into sex work and how participation in sex work affects social relations in turn. Finally, I'm keen to analyze how the connections between social relations and sex work shape female sex workers' everyday experiences and negotiations with power and violence. In order to briefly discuss the background, need, and relevance for my research, I'd like to draw your attention to the quotes on this slide. The first quote is from the Summary of Preliminary Findings from the first Pan-Indian Survey of Sex Workers 2011. It's a pretty self-explanatory quote, so I'm just going to read it out for you. Within it, the authors Sani and Shankar argue that studies of sex workers often reduce complex lives into simplistic binaries. Most commonly, an understanding of female sex workers as freely engaging in or forced into sex work. This is both inaccurate and insufficient. Much relevant information is ignored, such as family and social economic background, caste and religious segregation, sexual identities, marital status, not to mention work identities other than and in addition to sex work. The second quote on this slide sheds light on how these simplistic binaries of free and forced came into being. It is from Shah's 2014 book, Selling Corner Secrets, Sex Work and Migration in the City of Mumbai, where she discusses how prostitution in India has been constructed as ahistorical categories of violence and disease. She looks at the ways in which the development movement or discourses around human trafficking and HIV/AIDS have contributed to these constructions, and as a result, have demarcated sex work as an exceptional phenomenon requiring exceptional intervention. So my research argues against this exceptionalization of sex work in development practice and scholarship in India in the following ways. So it argues that women enter sex work as a livelihood strategy, but also as a product of experience within social relations. It addresses intersectionality, which, and I quote, emphasizes how different dimensions of social life cannot be separated out into different and pure strands. As such, a woman may be a mother and a sex worker, and the one role may impact upon the performance of the other. My research is rooted in context, so it links discussion on female sex workers' lives with larger existing scholarship on women's negotiations with patriarchy and power, violence against women, women's work in the unregulated labor market, and participation in social relations in India. And my research analyzes the exceptional interventions around human trafficking and HIV/AIDS within a context of social relations. So it looks at how these interventions affect, facilitate, and interrupt social relations in their practice. My research is qualitative in its approach, since, as Mason has argued, that this approach is concerned with how the social world is interpreted, understood, experienced, or produced, and uses data generation methods that are suitable to the social context. For my research, I collected data that maps the different experiences of a woman who decides to enter sex work in Eastern India. I collected data across 9.5 months, out of which 1.5 months was pre-field work or like a scoping visit. I used a combination of different methods, which were rooted in an ethnographic approach, such as participant observation. My methods also included elements of life history interviewing, where I asked my respondents to tell me about their lives, spanning their childhood, adolescence, romantic and marital relationships, and work experiences, thereby shifting the focus away from sex work alone. Overall, I collected data across 4 different sites, and I adapted my methods based on what suited the context. I located my research within and around the eastern Indian city of Kolkata, capital of the state of West Bengal, which shares its border with Bangladesh on the east, Nepal on the northwest, and Bhutan on the northeast. Specifically, I collected data from 2 prominent and historical red light areas in Kolkata, Sonagachi and Kalighat. I spent time with women rescued from sex work in an NGO-run, government-funded anti-trafficking shelter home in Narendrapur, a southern suburb of the city of Kolkata. I also met with women and girls who had returned to their residential communities in villages across the South 24 Parganas district of West Bengal after leaving sex work. This is a region that is known for high rates of human trafficking, female rural-urban migration, and crimes against women. So who were my respondents, the women at the center of my research? Overall, I had 51 respondents, which included, across the 2 red light areas, full-time and part-time female sex workers, retired sex workers, madams, and pimps. Additionally, it included peer health workers who were part of a sex workers collective, which had evolved from an HIV/AIDS intervention in the late 1990s. At the shelter home, I interacted with women rescued from different forms of work within the sex industry, victims of cross-border trafficking between Bangladesh and India, and victims of child marriages. In all these instances, the women's victimhood was defined by the state and not necessarily by the women themselves. Across the villages in the South 24 Parganas district, I interacted with women who had just returned to their residential communities after escaping sex work with the help of customers and peers or through anti-trafficking rescue mechanisms. I also met with 3 women whom I had first met as survivors of human trafficking in 2012. I wanted to see how their lives and social relations had changed over the last 3 to 4 years after returning to their villages, and I also met with their family members to get a better understanding of the changes in their lives. Additionally, across the 4 sites, I met with activists and professionals who work with the female sex working community through human trafficking and HIV/AIDS interventions. The social economic profile of my sample was determined by the access points, which were Kolkata-based NGOs that work with female sex workers. So these organizations helped me access a particular community or a specific space like the shelter home, after which I expanded my sample pool through a snowballing method. People I first met introduced me to others and so on. These women were largely from peri-urban or rural backgrounds, from residential localities surrounding Kolkata and from villages in the South 24 Parganas district. In terms of age, the range was quite wide, the youngest being 18 and the oldest 65. These were self-reported ages. Among the samples, 58.5% was Hindu and 41.5% was Muslim. Approximately 59% had experienced marriage and more than 60% had children, either through marriage or through sex work. In terms of nationality, there were 5 Bangladeshis and 1 Nepalese women. The rest were all Indian from the state of West Bengal. So we made it through the first part of the webinar, and now we move on to the second part where I shall share some of my analysis and key findings with you. So after collecting data in India, I returned to the UK in May 2015 using an inductive approach to analysis, which meant drawing out analytical themes from the data I had collected. Rather than using the data to confirm existing theory or assumption, I drew out the following areas of analysis. Within my data across interviews, women I met spoke repeatedly about their social identities, roles, and responsibilities, placing their experiences of sex work within a larger web of social relations, which was central to their identities as South Asian women, which is why I made this the overarching analytical theme. Within this, they spoke about how their experiences with power and violence within their families and marriages had led them to look for social and economic independence, which eventually led them to sex work. Secondly, they talked about trying to balance doing sex work with being mothers, daughters, wives, and partners. They shared their struggles of looking for love, romance, and intimacy with customers that they met through sex work. They spoke of forming family-like bonds with madams and customers, but also of the struggle to negotiate power and violence within these relationships. Thirdly, the women who had left sex work spoke of their experiences of being rescued or escaping on their own, and how these processes had affected social relations with their families, community, and the state. Over the course of the remainder of the webinar, I'd like to share with you briefly my key findings pertaining to the first 2 areas of analysis. So I will be talking about pathways into sex work and social relations in natal and marital families, and social relations in the red light areas and experiences of power and violence. In this slide on pathways into sex work, I have concentrated my key findings in 3 blocks which flow from left to right. So the first block on the left looks at relationships within natal families, moving on to experiences within marital families in the central block, and then the last block on the right explains ways in which women's attempts to escape social and economic dependence on natal and marital family members led them to sex work. So the findings in the first block on the left reflect how tension and conflict with natal family members influence the women's decision to leave home and look for kono kaj or any work. These tensions and conflicts were not exceptional in nature. In fact, they are deeply embedded into and occur due to the patriarchal, patrilineal, and patrivocal nature of traditional households in Bengali society. This implies a household that is headed by a male member, where inheritance is through the male line, and women move to their husbands' homes after marriage. Let's discuss this in a bit more detail. So women within my study talked about experiencing neglect and abuse during their upbringing. This often manifested in the form of food discrimination, accompanied by physical and verbal abuse. Researchers like Miller and Munro-McIntyre have challenged this long-held assumption about a direct correlation between poverty and son preference. In fact, Miller has argued that families with resources and assets like land often practice more son preference and discriminate more against daughters than families that are poorer. This is corroborated by Munro and McIntyre in their paper on ultra-poor female-headed households in Bangladesh. Within my study too, food discrimination was not linked directly to poverty, but to a change in social relations within the household. For example, when fathers took on new wives within Bengali Muslim households, and which led to the entrance of a stepmother into the existing household. Or conflict with bodhis or sisters-in-law in a Bengali Hindu household, where marriage to a high-earning male member in the family would imply that the sister-in-law could control resources and power within the household. Now, women within traditional patriarchal households in Bengali society take on power and rank through association with a high-earning male member. When the women in my research found themselves falling out of favor with women and men who held social and economic power within the household, it created the need to look for social independence either through marriage or economic independence through work, which would allow them to leave the household and in turn their dependence on an abusive social relationship. In terms of marriage then, in keeping with patriarchal norms, once the women left their natal families, their claim to that space as home became fragile. So in the second block, when women would experience domestic violence within their marriages or they were abandoned by their husbands who were often chosen for them by the natal families, or they had conflict with their in-laws over dowry issues, they returned to their natal households. But tensions arose again around the issue of ke bhar nebe, or who will take responsibility of this returned daughter and often the children that would accompany her from the failed marriage. Once again, the need for kono kaj or any work came about to escape dependence within social relations in the natal family. The women within my study had low technical skills and levels of literacy varied from primary school level education to about secondary level education. These women often dropped out of school before Madhyamik, which is a centralized examination conducted by the West Bengal state education system, so around the age of 13 or 14. So if we look at the third block now, these experiences within their marriages led these women to look for work, and given their low technical skills and low education levels, they often look for work in the unregulated labor market, so usually in domestic work, caregiving, babysitting, etc. In these kinds of work, low incomes, low levels of independence, high manual and physical labor, and often sexual harassment and sexual abuse led women to seek out sex work as a quote-unquote better option. Another way to escape social and economic dependence on natal families was to look for new prospective marital attachments with male acquaintances as a way to regain respectability and status in society. Often a lack of information about work offers and decreased vigilance in romantic relationships increased these women's vulnerability to exploitation. Many women I met during fieldwork who had been coercively sold into sex work were sold through women who were either supposed to marry them or give them work. Within my study, 22 women out of 41 had been trafficked by acquaintances on the pretext of work or marriage. 10 had entered sex work after working in other forms of irregular employment, and 9 had entered directly into sex work. Now let's discuss the lives of these women in the red light areas within my study. In order to analyze female sex workers' experiences of power and violence in a red light area, I've adopted the social relations framework, which is outlined in Naila Kabir's 1994 book, Reversed Realities, Gender Hierarchies in Development Thought. It's a framework that was developed to explore and address gender inequalities within the distribution of resources, responsibilities, and power in society, to unpack relationships of power between people and between people and resources and activities, and explore how these relationships are reworked through institutions like the state, market, community, and family. So the social relations approach defines institutions as a framework of rules to achieve certain economic and social goals in the production, reinforcement, and reproduction of social relations and social inequalities. Organizations like the family, the brothel, NGOs, and police then become specific structural forms that the institutions take on in a red light area. So in this diagram on the right, I have mapped the various organizations and the institutions that they are embedded in within red light areas within my study, although the specific nature and forms of these organizations differed across the two sites. For example, households in the red light areas in my research, although there were variations across the two sites, comprised female sex workers, their children, and babus, who are long-term customers. The market comprised customers, madams, and pimps. The state was represented by the police, and community by NGOs that provide drop-in centers for children or work on HIV/AIDS and human trafficking interventions. Now, the reason I've chosen this particular diagram to depict these institutions is to highlight the fact that these institutions influence and draw from each other, something that Kabir in her book has addressed as well. For example, she's argued that although gender norms and ideologies are created in the household, they affect women and men's participation in the market and shape their interactions with the state and community. So within the red light areas in my research, these institutions and the rules, activities, resources, people, and power within them, as I've tried to illustrate in the diagram on the left, overlapped in certain specific ways to shape female sex workers' social relations within the household, but also with members from other institutions. So the argument that I'm trying to make, therefore, is that female sex workers' experiences and negotiations with power and violence in sex work is shaped by these institutional overlaps which control and regulate the boundaries and expectations within these relationships. This, in turn, creates sources of conflict, tension, violence, and power inequalities. Let me give you very quickly some examples of how this manifested within my study before moving on to conclusions. So firstly, social relations in the red light area were shaped by people crossing over from one institution to another. So, for example, customers became romantic partners, madam took on caregiving duties and responsibilities, and sometimes children of female sex workers entered the sex work market. When transactional relationships with customers were imbued with expectations of intimacy and attachment, it created the potential for power inequalities and violence. For example, women within my study spoke about feeling manipulated by customers within these relationships, often over the issue of money. Frustrations within these relationships also led to self-harm and alcohol consumption to cope with infidelity and feelings of betrayal. Social relations within the red light area were prioritized based on traditional household structures. What that meant was that female sex workers tended to prioritize romantic relationships with customers over emotional relationships with madams. This was because female sex workers saw partnership with men as a means for economic and social independence through the establishment of a notun shongshar, or a new domestic order. But partners' families would often pose an obstacle to their marriage and setting up new domesticity, which often led to the women being abandoned by their partners. This prioritization also led to madams who had taken on caregiving responsibilities for the women in their employment, feeling abandoned and betrayed when the female sex workers in their employment left them to start lives outside sex work with men or to start their own businesses within the same red light area. NGOs and police would often step in to regulate these crossovers of people from one institution to another. For example, in Kalighat, NGOs provided drop-in centers for children, and these services centered on children's education to help them not enter sex work. But these services often involved taking the children out of the red light area to stop second-generation prostitution. This led to feelings of loss and loneliness. Mothers complained about losing their children, although they appreciated the financial support towards their education. NGO services in both red light areas around sexual health made female sex workers within my study feel uncomfortable and instrumentalized. They complained about, and I quote, periodically jabbed with needles when they felt other health issues within their relationships with customers and madams pertaining to physical health or mental health were not given equal attention. These led to experiences of disempowerment and instrumentalization, even within apparently supportive services. Confrontational interventions in Shonagachi meant removal of children from female sex workers' care due to fear of second-generation prostitution and rescue of female sex workers from madam and pimps to prevent trafficking. These processes were experienced as oppressive and painful by those who felt that they had established fulfilling social relations within the red light area. So during my fieldwork in Shonagachi, I was able to observe how one such anti-trafficking raid broke up a household of 3 female sex workers, a madam and a pimp. I'm happy to share the particularities of this incident after the presentation is over. So along with the crossovers between people from different institutions, overlaps between the rules of different institutions also affected negotiations with power and violence. Below I give you 2 examples from the Shonagachi red light area. So even when female sex workers were partially or fully in control of their earnings from sex work, there was a collective silence about the issue of sexual and physical violence by customers. When I probed this during fieldwork, the data showed that this silence was tied in part to the decision to not ruin a peer worker's core or household created through earnings from sex work. This particular quote on the slide by Mukta, a 19-year-old full-time female resident sex worker in Shonagachi, reveals how labor relations in the red light area are complex and interlinked, and how speaking out against violence to outsiders could disrupt the interconnected social ecosystem of maintaining a household within a red light area like Shonagachi. If I tell the NGO, they'll confront the pimp who sources the customers for the madam. The pimps will complain to the madam and threaten to close down the brothel, and that will be the end of us all. Even if I do it for my benefit, আমি কিভাবে অন্য একটা মেয়ের ঘর ভাঙতে পারি? How can I break another woman's home or livelihood? And secondly, the frequency of police rapes in Shonagachi coupled with its hypersexual atmosphere made it difficult for women to raise children within their households in a red light area. Most women could not afford to hire childcare or afford residential homes for their children. This made them revert to depending on natal and marital family members on raising children and balancing out this obligation by sending money home. This situation also created tension and conflict. This quote by Shampa, a 20-year-old female sex worker from Shonagachi, illustrates this. Today, the same stepmother who drove me into sex work is taking care of my daughter. This hurts a lot, but I can't help it. Hopefully, if I give her enough money, my daughter will be fine. Finally, I'm going to end with some concluding thoughts that I have been left with after going through the findings from this research. Given my background of working in NGOs in India before entering academia, they've made me think more deeply about how we design our interventions to be more, and how we can design them to be more meaningful and take into account the complexity of the lives of the people we work with through research and practice. I'm just going to read out some of these thoughts to you before I end. So how can and do our interventions with female sex workers take their social worlds and intersectional identities into account? How can our interventions engage with how institutional overlaps affect female sex workers' experiences with power and violence? How can our interventions address the specificities of power inequalities and violence within sex work without taking away women's agency? And finally, how can our interventions respect agency without dismissing the patriarchal, unequal foundations of sex work? Here's some references. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mirna. That was wonderful. It's really useful for our Strive community to get your perspective from a development background, because, we're kind of in public health and there is such a different angle from this. So I invite questions from everyone. So I'm going to start with one. I'm kind of really interested in what we don't have much evidence of or data from in the research we've been doing is sort of people from shelter homes. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, how that was different, also from your research, how the people differed there from the people in Shonagachi, for example. And just a little bit more on the shelter homes, because I think that's really interesting.
Thank you, Martine. I think within my fieldwork, the shelter home was a very fascinating space for data collection. So when I approached a particular NGO in Kolkata called Shonlap, and they run a big anti-trafficking shelter home in the outskirts of the city, when I approached them to access women rescued from sex work, I didn't expect that I would also be meeting a lot of women who don't fit into the sort of stereotypical victim of anti-trafficking mode. So a lot of these women that I met, or young girls that I met actually, were so-called victims of child marriage within the shelter home. And they were living there along with women who were rescued from sex work. Now, one of the reasons for this is because this particular shelter home is government funded. And because it's government funded, it sort of covers all victims who require protection by the state. So this is not just limited to people who are rescued from sex work, but also any other kind of exploitative situation like sexual violence or child marriage, which was the case here. Now, what was interesting about speaking to these girls was I realized that in a lot of ways, their decisions to marry was shaped by their desire for partners who were not chosen by their parents. What that meant was that these so-called victims of child marriage were essentially adolescent girls who had run away with their boyfriends against the wishes of their parents. Usually the parents didn't approve of these men because they were about the same age, so they were also students. they were either not from the same community or the same caste. And when these women ran away, or when these girls ran away with their partners, the parents would often file a case of child marriage with the police, and these girls would then be brought into the shelter home. In my conversations with them, I began to see parallels between sort of like the child marriage discourse and the sort of human trafficking discourse, because it made me realize how shelter homes function as a way to regulate women's sexuality and women's mobility within a patriarchal society. So while women who were rescued from sex work were being counseled not to re-enter sex work because it's bad work, it's not good work for women, the girls who had run away with their partners were being counseled to return home to their parents, to focus on their education, and essentially sort of be subordinate to their parents' opinions. And I found this parallel very interesting, because although the anti-trafficking discourse has emerged as an exceptional discourse, it ultimately comes down to telling women not to move out of their villages, telling women not to enter certain kinds of occupation that is not deemed appropriate socially, and so on. And the shelter home really gave me an opportunity to see that in a broader context and look at it in comparison with girls, say, who were child marriage victims.
That's really interesting, because, even the term victim, like the girls who run away from home to, be with their partner, it sounds like that was a real empowered action. And we frame them as victims. Shall I read the question out from Divya? Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Did you explore the aspect of how women in sex work save their money?
Thank you, Divya, for that question. I didn't explore how they save their money, but what I did explore was how does money affect their social relationships. So indirectly, I did actually also look at the ways in which they save and invest and all of that. So within the two red light areas in my study, this particular sex workers collective, Durbar, they offer a sort of savings service to these women. There is a sort of a financial co-op, if you will, where these women are able to invest their money, and they're able to increase the value of their money according to some levels of interest that are imposed by the co-op. But what was also interesting was also to see how money played such a big role in their relationships. So when they entered relationships with customers, often the customers would end up asking for money to get some kind of financial support, and then these women would go to the savings collective and ask for their money back, and that would lead to a lot of discussion about, where the woman at the co-op would be like, do you really think you want to do this? You've been saving this money for so long. Do you really want to take it away for a man? And then the sex worker herself would be like, no, this is my decision, and I want to use my money the way I see fit. And I found these conversations around money incredibly fascinating. So I hope this answers your question.
That's great. There is a question from Chuba, who asks, where do you place CBOs, community-based organizations?
Thanks, Shubha, for that question. So I looked at the role of community-based organizations in the third area of my analysis, which I actually didn't share the findings from today because we didn't have the time. So when these women go back to their rural residential communities in the South 24 Parganas district, their resettlement in the community is facilitated by community-based organizations. And these community-based organizations provide them sort of legal services and financial services and livelihood services. But there are also lots of tensions within this relationship because these community-based organizations are, in many ways, they represent the society in which they're embedded. So the women who come back from sex work often want to re-migrate. They want to have relationships within the community, not necessarily get married, but, have romantic relationships. And the CBOs are not very approving of that. So there are lots of tensions around that as well, and I address that within the third area of my analysis.
There was a similar question by Alyssa who thanks you for the presentation, and then says, did you look at how the legal framework around sex work in India influences sex workers' relations with the market as well as the state, particularly the state, and even their relationship with NGOs?
Thanks for that question, Alyssa. Yes, in a way I did. So as you already might know, that in India the legal situation is a little bit it's a little bit ambivalent. So it doesn't criminalize sex work per se. So it doesn't criminalize the purchase and selling of sexual services. What it does criminalize is this commercial organization of madams and pimps and all of this. So what is interesting about this is that the two red light areas that I chose for my research, they were very different in terms of the material realities of doing sex work. So Kalighat was a place where women were primarily selling sex work on their own without the presence of visible madams and pimps, whereas Shonagachi had a very complicated sort of system and hierarchy of madams and pimps. And that influenced these women's relationships with the state, definitely. For example, in Kalighat, the police was definitely a presence in the red light area, but the women spoke of the police in very generous terms. They said that the police are here to protect us, they understand us, they understand that, we are doing this because there's a financial need. We don't see them as enemies. Whereas in Shonagachi, because the commercially sort of the nature of the organized sex work is in essence illegal, the women saw the police as their enemies, and they often said how these police take bribes from us. They often threaten us, and they also felt because of this antagonistic relationship with the police that they couldn't go to them if there was an issue around sexual violence, if there was an issue around theft, if there was any other kind of issue around crimes within the red light area. So yes, in that sense, it definitely did affect how they interacted with the state. And even their relationship with NGOs, because within Shonagachi, they saw NGOs that were anti-trafficking NGOs. They saw them in a similarly negative light, and they said that these people from NGOs, they come and take our children away, they come and take our sisters away, like when madams were talking about women in their employment. Whereas in Kalighat, it seems like the NGO services were seen more as being supportive rather than confrontational. And this definitely had to do with the legal precarity of doing sex work in Shonagachi over Kalighat.
Then there is Mike Ferguson from FHI 360. His question is, what was the nature of the NGO work observed in the area? In particular, were any NGOs in the area offering economic strengthening programs for the women, saving facilities, financial literacy training, or was the NGO strictly health-focused?
Thank you for that question, Michael. I presume when you say NGO work in the area, you mean the red light area, so I'm going to answer based on that assumption. So as I said, the two most prominent NGOs in the two red light areas was an organization called Durbar, or GMSC, which is a sex workers collective that had originated out of a strictly HIV/AIDS awareness program that was started in that area in the 1990s. They call themselves a sex workers collective now, and a part of their work is to facilitate savings of sex workers, is to provide them legal aid and provide them educational services. But within my fieldwork, what I noticed was, and this has a lot to do with how these programs are funded. It isn't something that the organizations are strictly choosing to do on their own. It's definitely controlled by the kind of funding that they're getting. That most of their work was health-oriented, but definitely more sexual health than, say, physical or mental health.
Thank you. And then there is Becky Walker from South Africa. Thanks you for the fascinating presentation. And then in relation to the question on trafficking, I'm interested in the extent to which the trafficking rhetoric controls discussions on sex works and leads to greater harms against sex workers. Here in South Africa, we see that the moral panic around trafficking and anti-trafficking measures detract from a discussion on decriminalization and heightens the risk sex workers face. It essentially blocks discussions on how to make sex work safer. Is this similar in the context you looked at? And I would say in your different sampling sites.
Thanks for the question, Becky. I would say yes. I would say that the anti-trafficking discourse is definitely a very strong framework for any kind of discussion on sex work and sex workers' lives in Kolkata and West Bengal. This is also because data over the years has shown that a large number of women are trafficked from rural areas in West Bengal to cities like Kolkata, but also cities like Bombay and Delhi. Now, often data of this sort is a little bit questionable, and you're not very sure what is informing data like this. But there has been this spike in interest around anti-trafficking over the last decade, and this has definitely influenced conversation around sex workers. What is really interesting, and this is also sort of to answer Mike's question, and I forgot to mention that there, is that this health organization that I was talking about, which is the Sex Workers Collective, apart from focusing on HIV/AIDS awareness, they also run something called a self-regulation board within the red light area, which basically is, according to them, a way for the community to stop trafficking of women below the age of 18 into sex work. So anyone who's below the age of 18 is not allowed to remain in the red light area. And they do this by appointing sex workers from within the community onto this self-regulation board, as well as having counselors and members from government organizations on the board. Now, one of the reasons why they sort of established this self-regulation board was because they faced allegations about facilitating sex work through their work, because the Sex Workers Collective, they are arguing for sex work to be recognized as work. They're arguing for decriminalization of sex work. They're arguing for reduction of stigma. And within their work, they also had to deal with claims that they weren't doing enough to reduce trafficking. And so the Self-Regulation Board came up as a way to also include the anti-trafficking discourse within their work and say, just because we are from the community doesn't mean that we support trafficking. So in that sense, it's definitely very strongly a part of conversations around sex work and work around sex work in Kolkata.
Great. There is a second question from Becky. You mentioned the drop-in centers for children of sex workers, and I'm interested in what kinds of messages are conveyed to children there in terms of what their mothers do. Are they let to see their mothers as sex workers in the negative light, or is there any space to recognize selling sex as a form of supporting families, etc.?
That is a really interesting question, Becky, and I wanted to probe this further during my fieldwork. But honestly, I mean, I think this question would be a question for another thesis entirely. But from the kind of data collection that I did, the woman that I spoke to who heads this particular organization called New Light, she did say that, the organization and its counselors are trained to not increase stigma of sex work in the kind of messages that they give to the children. So the children are made aware of the fact that their mothers are doing it for financial and social needs. Often they're doing it for the children's education and welfare themselves. But at the same time, they're also explained that this is not a viable occupation and there are other options that are available, which is why I mentioned that a lot of these services in the drop-in center involved giving children scholarships to schools outside of the red light area, in fact, outside of the state sometimes as well. So their services did involve creating some physical distance between the children and the red light area. When I spoke to some of the women whose children had, sort of gone through this or had availed of these services, they didn't see their children very often, and they talked about that, and they spoke about it as almost a form of acceptance that this is inevitable. So when they said that when we approached this organization and said, please take care of our children, we're almost like deferring motherhood. So we kind of expected that, we wouldn't be able to see our children that much. And this organization also said that when the children do come back from, say, the residential schools outside of the state or the city, they are encouraged to visit their mothers. But when they do visit their mothers, they're often accompanied by people from the organization themselves, or the mothers are told, please make sure during this time you have no customer there. So this sort of extraordinary situation is created so that the child can come and meet the mother. And obviously this creates a lot of tension and issues. And I mean, as I said, this would be a subject for a whole entire thesis entirely.
And you're not ready for that yet.
I'm trying to do one.
So there's a question from Pippa Granville here at LSHTM. I was really interested to hear your findings on how women would often stay silent about client violence, so not to disrupt work environments and to protect other women's livelihoods. I wonder if you could say a bit more about this and what you think the implications might be for peer and community interventions to tackle violence.
Thanks for the question, Pippa. This is a really interesting revelation during fieldwork. As an outsider from the surface, there seems like because of the work that the Sex Workers Collective has been doing, it seems like there is a lot of space for women to talk about violence. There's a lot of space for women in sex work to talk about harassment, often implicit forms of violence. For example, one female sex worker was being blackmailed by a customer who was from her village, and who told her that if you don't essentially sleep with me for free, I will go back and tell everyone in the community about you. So these kind of implicit forms of control and violence as well. So it seemed like there was a space available for these women to talk about it. But then when I actually began to talk to them about it, they were very aware of, this sort of divide between the inside world and the outside world. And they said that, when I said that, okay, so you're not talking to NGOs about this, you're not talking to the police about this because you're scared that it will shut down the brothel, then how are you dealing with this? And what some of the women said is that we talk about it amongst ourselves, that we usually when, late at night when some of them don't have clients or certain times during the day, they sit together in groups and they share their experiences. Sometimes this often happens over the use of alcohol because often sharing these experiences can be extremely traumatic. They've sort of established like these peer groups within the community itself within the physical space of the brothel where they sit around and they talk about these experiences. And I think that one of the ways in which organizations can help these women speak more about these experiences actually by strengthening these existing peer-based networks. Instead of emphasizing that an outside intervention is important and that these women need to leave the brothel or need to leave the red light area to speak to, say, the police or the NGOs, if there are ways in which we can find ways to strengthen these existing peer support networks within these groups, maybe sort of helping them to talk about violence in ways that doesn't require alcohol use, doesn't require drug use, doesn't involve self-harming as a way to cope. I think that would be a good way to go about this.
Great. And then April Murphy has another question going back to the children. So what do the women you met with see as a solution for them to have their children close and still provide a safe place and education? How do you think NGOs could support this?
Thanks for your question, April. The thing is that there was no single sort of consensus on this issue. There were a lot of women who preferred having their children taken away. They preferred not having their children there in the red light area, whereas some other women sort of wanted to have their children around and really felt upset about the fact that these children were being taken away by the police. I think what it seemed to me from the data, what the data suggested is that these women preferred it when their children were being raised by family members, either by their own parents or by siblings. And one of the issues with this was that often if they had, as I mentioned in my slide earlier during the presentation, that if they had difficult relationships with the family, then this process of long-distance child raising also created tension and possibilities of conflict. One of the ways in which this is something that I've been thinking about as well, but one of the ways is if community-based organizations can create spaces within these female sex workers' residential communities for them to have their children be raised by women within the community, within, say, for example, informal creches or daycare, something like that, for example, in the instances where the family doesn't want to take care of the child and the woman has to take care of the child within the red light area. That could be one of the ways to go about it. But honestly, in a space like Sonagachi, I was quite taken aback by how hypersexual and aggressive the environment is. And although a lot of women had said that they felt safe there because they'd been living there for a while and they want an outsider like me and their opinions are valid, in many ways I think we also need to recognize that as organizations or as interventionists, whether through research or practice, it is our job to also spot vulnerability, even when people within the situation can't see the vulnerability. So there are ways in which we need to be creating dialogue about vulnerability of children in a red light area, which doesn't involve taking these children away or doesn't involve making these women feel like they're not good enough mothers. This is a very complicated process. I don't know how this is going to happen, but this is just one of the thoughts that I had.
Very interesting. Another question from Guru Kiran Kamath. At present, the government in India is planning to push for a new bill to address human trafficking. The majority of sex workers have offered or have opted for sex work to meet their livelihood, and they believe sex work is work. So did any responded on this? Did anyone, was it clear that they recognize sex work as work, or were there differences along the sites and across the site. Sorry.
I mean, this is a question of how do you understand and unpack a discourse. So, for example, the sex workers collective that has a very prominent role across the post-red light areas, they do a lot of work around pushing for sex work to be recognized as work. They call sex workers, sort of workers, and we demand workers' rights. But across the community, there's a lot of diversity of opinion about this. A lot of women don't see themselves as workers. They see themselves as, women doing this temporarily. They don't necessarily want that tag or the rights that come with being workers, whereas some other women feel very strongly that they do. I think for a lot of these women, they see sex work as a form of lifestyle that they have chosen because of certain situations in their life. And they also see it as a way to, as I mentioned in my presentation, to establish new domesticity and new economic independence. So they don't necessarily see it as work. I mean, I think these are also terms that have sort of come down to the community from the discourses around them. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, there's a little bit of ambivalence around this, definitely.
No, that's interesting. It's sort of a fluid category, sort of like how we or how the rights-based approaches are pushing for sex work as work, and that's not always how it is conceptualized, and people actually don't see this as a career, and they do acknowledge the temporality of it. Okay, I think we're coming to our last question, and that's from Divya again. Do the state, community, market, and households help women in sex work save their money, and or do they serve as barriers in saving habits?
Thanks for your question, Divya. As I mentioned before, so definitely, I mean, the community, which is represented by NGOs in the red light areas, particularly the sex workers collective, they provide support to female sex workers to save their money. As far as the state is concerned, these women are not recognized as legal citizens. So for them, getting identification is very, very difficult. And if you don't have identification in India, it's very hard to open an account in a bank. So there's a lot of implicit and explicit forms of stigma that prevent these women from saving money in official saving mechanisms, say, provided by the state. As far as the market is concerned, it's quite interesting because sometimes madams play the role of the accountant for the female sex workers. So often in Shonagachi, for example, I saw that a lot of women had sort of relegated the responsibility of saving money and keeping a track of the money to the madams who employed them. Now, obviously, this was done with a certain degree of trust, but when it actually came to sort of taking the money from the madam, if they wanted to leave and go to another madam, or if they wanted to start their own business, this created an issue of conflict, and this created issues which were often violent, where the madam felt like she was being cheated and that she doesn't owe the amount of money that the woman thinks that she owes her and all of that. So that was quite interesting.
Actually, there's one more question. Sorry. So from Jan Kuchera, have you seen the use of technology to have any impact, positive or negative, on the sex workers and their community? And I presume it's mobile phone technology mainly.
Thanks, Dan, for that question and for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. Within my field work, I found that WhatsApp, which is something that almost all of us are familiar with, is a communication tool that's used very, very strongly by female sex workers, especially those who are sort of between the ages of 19 and sort of late 20s. They prefer using this over, say, calling each other because it gives them sort of neutrality in terms of how they express themselves. It's a way for them to keep in touch with their customers without having to necessarily talk to them. And what was interesting about these the conversations happening over WhatsApp was that they often also made use of images to communicate how they felt with their peers or with their partners. So they often sent images of, say, songs, for example, or they sent images displaying romance or friendship. And as I got to know these women during fieldwork, I also started to receive these images, and I also started to receive these songs. So WhatsApp has definitely been used as a tool for them to build friendship and sort of perform romance in a way that they wouldn't normally be able to because their lives are so hectic. Another interesting thing about mobile phones is that, and I'll be writing about this in my methodology chapter, is how I felt like mobile phones were sort of representative of the identities of these women. So almost every sex worker had more than one, sort of SIM card. She used a different number for her family members, a different number for customers, a different number for friends, and often she switched the sort of numbers within the number cards within the mobile phone based on who she wanted to be in touch with. So when the women went home, for example, they told me not to call on X and Y number because that will be deactivated, because when they go back home, they are members of a family, they're members of a community, they're not sex workers. Whereas when they come back to the red light areas and they tell their family members, I'm going to be working, often their family members don't know what kind of work they're doing, but they tell their family members I will be inaccessible, and then the other number is used. So in a sense, the mobile phone was like a constant companion to these women as they went about performing different social roles and responsibilities within their lives. And there were lots of instances where their phones got stolen or they got broken, and it caused a lot of distress to these women. And they kept saying, I don't feel like a full person because I don't have my mobile phone. So it was quite interesting to see that during fieldwork.
Well, Mirna, we've run out of time now, so that is, it was just, it now is to me to thank you and to thank everyone on the call for all the interesting questions and for the interesting discussion. I feel very confident that your PhD is going to be a great contribution to the field with the mix of samples that you have and with your hard work that you put into it, because that's already very clear from the presentation you made. So thank you so much for that. Okay, well, thank you very, very much to all.